Good afternoon, everyone. Secretary, distinguished guests, Defence colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Very fitting we're in the Ngunnawal Theatre. And I'm delighted to welcome you today to the presentation by Dr. Lauren Wilson, our 2017 recipient of the Secretary of Defence Fellowship. This annual fellowship supports innovative postgraduate research aimed at contributing to defence outcomes. The selected fellow is required to complete a master's degree doing research at an Australian university and optionally, potentially could even be upgraded to a PhD. The Secretary of Defence Fellowship is highly valued by our department, and certainly in DST we see it as a touchstone for science excellence. You need to be really in the A-League to win this fellowship in a very competitive defence-wide process. I'm pleased to say that in the past 6 years, defence scientists have measured up and been successful on 3 occasions. In 2012, analyst Elena Morozenko won the fellowship to research military decision-making. In 2014, Greg Calvert undertook a study of ADF fuel requirements and fuel supply chain sustainability for his fellowship project, which is a very sort of topical project these days, and I think it certainly informed a lot of the work we're doing in the department these days. Both these research efforts were invaluable in informing defence activities, including the Force Structure Review and the 2016 Defence White Paper. So this year's recipient, or I should say last year's recipient, was giving a lecture this year, which is a fitting time to report back on her results, won the fellowship to undertake research in military forensic and technical exploration. Lauren completed her research in December 2017 at the National Centre for Forensic Studies at the University of Canberra. And in fact, the work is so strong, she's actually been able to convert it, not into a master's, but into a PhD, which she submitted in July this year. So forensic science is well known for supporting law enforcement and criminal justice system. However, military organisations also need forensic science capabilities to support intelligence objectives and potential criminal prosecutions. There's been very little academic study of the military forensic and technical exploitation system. So Dr. Wilson's research project addresses this gap by answering the question, what is the most efficient framework for defence to undertake forensic and technical exploitation activities as a coordinated joint capability? It's also a good time to remember that military forensic science is far from the glamorous picture portrayed in the popular TV series NCIS. And anyone knows what the N stands for? Naval Criminal Investigative Services. I didn't know that, but it was interesting. It is a military forensics unit, although the lab is not real, I'm told. Rather, it's a much more. Real forensic science is a much more painstaking work that requires many more specialists and longer turnaround times to find solutions than the Hollywood might suggest. So we're going to be hearing from Dr. Wilson about her findings, but I should give a quick background to her and her expertise. So in 2016, Dr. Wilson completed her PhD at the Australian National University Medical School, where she pioneered work on viral countermeasures and established the Infectious Disease Research Laboratory. So Lauren's actually now got one of the few people I know with 2 PhDs, so quite extraordinary in that sense. So from 2017 to 2011, she has been team leader in biological intelligence for the Australian Federal Police, analysing biological agents being used for malicious purposes. She has served as a member of the Interpol Bioterrorism Expert Group. In this role, she has written bioterrorism manuals and delivered international bioterrorism awareness training. At DST, she is the Forensic Science Program Manager in our National Security Science and Technology Centre. And in December, Lauren was selected for a very competitive process to take up the new role as Counsellor, Defence and National Security S&T in Washington, D.C. in the embassy there. So congratulations on this important international appointment. You'll be a great ambassador for us. And let me just now say, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Lauren Wilson to give us her address.
Thanks, Alex. Let me first acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. So thank you for the introduction, Alex. And thank you to the Secretary of Defence for sponsoring this fellowship, and also to DST Group for the further support of my research and for organising this briefing today. So Alex mentioned that the fellowship applications are actually quite competitive. I actually applied a couple of times to do a fellowship, and each time I took the feedback from the panel and improved on my application, and then I got it. And I have to say, in my career, I've had two highlights. One has been working with the Interpol as a bioterrorism team, and the second has been the Secretary of Defence Fellowship. So if anyone is actually thinking of applying for the fellowship, I highly encourage you to do so. If you don't get it the first time, take the feedback and apply again. It is really worth the effort. Also, if anyone wants to discuss applications, I'm happy to discuss any fellowship applications with people. So what I'm going to do today is give you an introduction on what military forensic and technical exploitation, and Alex points out it's different to what you see on TV. I'll talk about my research where I looked at the systems approach to military forensic and technical exploitation. I'll then propose a way forward for the ADF for forensic and technical exploitation. So battlefield forensics, also known as expeditionary forensics or deployed forensics, is actually a combination of forensic science and technical exploitation. The main objectives are for prevention and disruption of events. We need to target adversaries, and also for force protection countermeasures. Battlefield forensics is actually part of full spectrum exploitation within the ADF. So full spectrum exploitation ranges from tactical questioning up to complex forensic analysis. Since the drawdown from Iraq and Afghanistan, the Defence Force forensic capability has diminished, but there is a strategic need to enhance this. For the rise of global terrorism and foreign fighters means we need to ensure a secure and resilient Australia and Australian interests. So the 2016 Defence White Paper states that we need a comprehensive understanding or situational awareness to protect our deployed forces. So forensic and technical exploitation is one mechanism that we can achieve this. A specific mechanism we're doing is the LAND 154, which is the Weapons Technical Intelligence Capability. This will see the construct of two deployed laboratories, and it will be initiated in 2020 with the first laboratory at the 1st Intelligence Battalion in Brisbane and the second one in Defence Science and Technology Group in Adelaide. So within the law enforcement domain, the typical forensic disciplines include your latent print examination, drug and explosive chemistry, DNA analysis, firearms and tool marks. So these can vary between the labs and between deployed forces and national capabilities. But within the military domain, there's another important discipline, and that's technical exploitation. This combines electrical engineering with mechanical engineering, and this is very important for force protection countermeasures within the military domain. So the forensic analysis allows us to make linkages. Now these may be linkages between devices, individuals' devices, also individuals to events. So the forensic reporting informs greater intelligence, so fused with all source intelligence, and is disseminated to the intelligence community for targeting of adversaries, as well as development of prosecution packages for the criminal justice system. So the objectives of forensic and technical exploitation actually map to two of the key objectives within the 2016 Defence White Paper. These strategic objectives include secure and resilient as Australia and Australian interests, and the forensic objectives that map to this are national security, counter-terrorism, as well as law enforcement and intelligence objectives. And the second strategic objective in the White Paper for a rule-based global order also maps to national security and intelligence, but also to counter-proliferation and humanitarian and disaster relief. The main objectives or outcomes from this include prosecution in a criminal justice system, targeting identification, force protection, as well as battle damage assessment. So one of the main reasons I wanted to undertake this fellowship in forensic and technical exploitation is the current system, it's complex. It's a set of divergent capabilities that aren't integrated at the joint level or whole of government enterprise level. So key strategic reviews such as the Independent Intelligence Review, the 2016 Defence White Paper, and the First Principles Review all call for a more integrated, interoperable and coordinated system. So the new Home Affairs portfolio is one mechanism which is allowing us to have a greater integrated capability at the whole of government enterprise level. We can leverage off this for forensic and technical exploitation. So we need to know that the different agencies are not all under the Home Affairs portfolio. For example, the criminal justice system is with the Director of Public Prosecution. The law enforcement system is the AFP and Border Force, which are part of the Home Affairs portfolio, but we also have to consider the state and territory police forces. The military system as Department of Defence isn't part of Home Affairs, and also the intelligence system with a newly established Office of National Intelligence. So to ensure that we don't end up with a siloed forensic and technical exploitation capability, we need to consider this in a joint system and at an enterprise level for whole of government. So my research objective, and the question I wanted to answer, is what is the most efficient framework for Defence to undertake forensic and technical exploitation activities as an integrated joint capability? So to answer this question, this is the academic part of my talk, I looked at organisational theory. Specifically, I looked at the modern organisation theory. And this stipulates the best way to look at an organisation is to study it as a system. So all systems take inputs from the environment, they process it to give outputs that add value to the environment. So when we look at it as a system, when we get multiple systems being joined up, they form a system of system which has a unique capability. Under the One Defence approach, Defence is moving to look at moving away from a platform-based approach and towards a system of systems approach where we focus more on the capabilities. So by focusing more on the capabilities, we look at the outputs of what the platforms will produce. So within Defence, all military platforms are actually part of a system of systems, even if we're not describing them as such. Similarly, forensic science is part of a system of system, even though my work is the first time we've looked at it this way. So if we describe forensic science as a system of systems, we can see that it's a subsystem within the larger systems, and these systems are the criminal justice system, law enforcement system, military system, and the intelligence systems. Important secondary subsystems include forensic intelligence, as well as the biometric systems. And other components are the all-source intelligence fusion, quality management, as well as risk and issue management. So there's a few advantages to describing forensic science as a system or system. The first advantage is that it takes into consideration contingency theory. Contingency theory postulates that there is no one organisational setup and it's contingent on the operating environment. So this means when we take into account contingency theory that this system of systems approach is fit for purpose for the current fight, but will be flexible and adaptable to any future conflicts. Another advantage is that it's made up of units. All systems comprise of different units. And for a risk to happen and to get a critical failure within a unit, you need multiple failures within the system. So for example, when we get a failure in the forensic science system of system, if that failure carries through to the law enforcement investigation and criminal justice system, that's when we get a miscarriage of justice and critical systems failure. But when we look at forensic science as a system of system approach, we are able to mitigate against those risks at each level and hopefully prevent those critical system failures. So what I'm going to do is now just to outline how we can integrate the forensic science system and system at a whole of government level and how we integrate with law enforcement capabilities and also how we do that at the enterprise level for ADF. So the rise in global terrorism and return foreign fighters is meaning that we need a concept of operation to ensure that military operations preserve the prosecution option. So within the law enforcement domain, they've developed forensic intelligence models. And this is where the forensic data can inform an investigation earlier than the criminal justice system. So about 10 years ago, the forensic data would be done for a single case for prosecution of a single person in the criminal justice system. But by informing the investigation earlier in the system, we can disrupt criminal activity. So this is similar to the concept of full spectrum exploitation that's being employed in the ADF. The main objective of full spectrum exploitation is intelligence for targeting. But what we need to do within the ADF is incorporate that forensic intelligence model so that we preserve the prosecution in a criminal justice system operation if need be. So if we had a returned foreign fighter, we could prosecute in a court of law within Australia. So if we look at the ADF, we need to consider forensic and technical exploitation at an enterprise level. So I've discussed Land 154, where we'll be getting the deployable facilities. But we also need to consider the Land 154 within the enterprise. So this means we need to consider it with site exploitation, the national capabilities within Australia, and maritime capabilities such as shipboarding operations. So to do that, if we look at the various projects that make up full spectrum exploitation, we can see that Land 8410 will give the ADF site exploitation capability. Land 3025 will give SOA the deployable CBRN defence capability. Land 2110 for the conventional forces. And we need to look at this as a whole so we can ensure we have interoperability. So to do that, we need linkages between the forward capability with site exploitation and also our national and maritime capabilities. So these linkages can be physical linkages, like movement of material that's captured on the battlefield from the site to the forward lab for analysis or back to national lab for deeper analysis. They can also be non-physical linkages, so like movement of knowledge, so a knowledge management system or biometrics data that needs to be moved on the battle space. So to consider this, we need to look at knowledge management. And that project within Defence is JP 2096. So we need to consider it as a whole system for full spectrum exploitation. The other thing we need to consider is that we need an appropriately trained and resourced workforce for workforce planning. And we also need the legal authority and legislation and policy for able to do the full spectrum exploitation within Defence. So one of my main recommendations was that we needed to implement forensic and technical exploitation system of systems, which also requires sponsorship and establishment of an implementation team. So I recommended that the authority could reside within VCDF, SPNI, or CJOPS. So I briefed the Secretary and CDS on the outcomes of my fellowship on the 3rd of April earlier this year. And the feedback I got from the Secretary was that he would like further information on who this joint authority should be. So between now and then, what I've done is I've liaised with all the relevant stakeholders to discuss this issue. So in meeting with the Joint Counter-Improvised Threat Task Force, JCITF Brigadier, we discussed the fact that the Joint Force Authority for CBRN and as well as Counter-UAS resides within JCITF. So it stands to reason that JCITF should actually be the Joint Force Authority for full spectrum exploitation. This would mean that the capability managers in Land, ISR, EW would still have the authority that resides there for management of the projects, and the units would retain their authority and JCITF would act as a joint force integrator. So the proposed way ahead is JCITF have worked with Land, ISR and EW capability management for the development of a full spectrum exploitation joint capability needs statement. Then this statement has formed a strategy which JCITF are putting in front of the JCCC on the 7th of November for noting. And within this strategy, it recommends that JCITF is the Joint Force Authority for full spectrum exploitation and the formation of an integration steering committee which will be at the 1-star level. JCITF have already done a lot of great work within this area since I briefed the Secretary earlier this year, and they've established an exploitation working group. And the working group is looking at 3 key issues, and have 3 subgroups within it. The first key issue is knowledge management. So with Land 154, when the project was first scoped and it wasn't considered as a system design, it was scoped without a knowledge management system or a biometrics database. So this was a risk for the project. So what the Exploitation Working Group and the Sub-Working Group are doing is working with JP 2096 to ensure that they have the appropriate knowledge management system, and also looking at how we can get a biometrics database for the capability. And also looking at legislative and policy framework. So if we get the capability, we still also need the legislation and policy to allow us to, say, share information with the Australian Federal Police or State and Territory Police, or share information with our Five Eyes partner nations. The other key thing is the workforce planning. So if we have JCITF as the Joint Force Authority, they need to be appropriately resourced and manned, to actually undertake that authority. At the moment, they have 1 person who can work on legislation and policy framework, but to actually get the envision of the full spectrum exploitation, you would need about 2 people for a year as contractors to implement this. So by implementing and ensuring that we have appropriately resourced and planned full spectrum exploitation, what we really get in return is efficiencies. By linking to JP 2096 means that future phases of 154 don't have to scope and spend money on a knowledge management system, and that we're appropriately looking at a system of systems design within defence. So we get the efficiencies there. We make sure we have the right standards and capabilities across the entire systems, and interoperability, and all of this leads to a better capability for the ADF and the whole of government. So I just also wanted to discuss some of my fellowship outputs. So I've presented my fellowship report. My PhD thesis was submitted in July this year. I've had, from my PhD thesis, it's formed by publication, so I've had 7 publications accepted and printed. I also have one that's submitted and under review at the moment, and I was invited to give the Australian and New Zealand Forensic Science Society Symposium plenary earlier this month. So they're the outputs that I have from my fellowship. The outcomes and what we're achieving is that I'm working with the US to write the Five Eyes Forensic and Technical Exploitation Handbook. So the research I've done for my fellowship will be incorporated into this handbook for the Five Eyes community. Also, I've been working with Defence Forensic and Biometrics agencies in the US. They've been working for 12 years on their enterprise for forensic and biometrics. They've read my research and they've noted that they're going to be using the system and systems design to sync their enterprise. So what this means is that the system and system design is going to be integrated into the Five Eyes Forensic and Technical Handbook, as well as the Forensic and Biometrics agency. So implementing it within Defence means we're aligning with our Five Eyes partners, but not just aligning with them, we're actually leading the development of system and system for forensics. So in summary, I've recommended that the system and system approach is the best framework for defence for forensic and technical exploitation. And it proposed that it's implemented through the full spectrum exploitation joint capability needs statement with JCITF as the joint force authority. So what this really means for defence is we're meeting the FPR 1 defence objectives. We're having a more unified and integrated capability. It's going to be joint force enabled. It's going to have a centralised authority. It'll have the clear strategy, but the most important point, it will enable efficiencies. So I'd like to thank the Secretary again for sponsoring the fellowship, DST Group, who've provided a lot of support for me during the fellowship research, and also my University of Canberra supervisors, and there's a bunch of people on this because I did liaise with a lot of people in development this. So thank you for everyone for coming, especially on a Friday afternoon. So thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you, Lauren. Then don't go away. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions. I think that's a presentation is worthy of people reflecting and maybe asking a question or two So we'll take that then. Yes. Could you speak up, please?
I really enjoyed your presentation. I can see, how much was needed as well. I've learned a lot from it. Just a question about the biometric data that will be collected. What other data, which will typically be from unknown sources that you need to identify, what other data will that be shared with?
So when we collect the biometric data, how are we sharing it?
Yeah, what other data will you compare that to?
At the moment, we don't actually have the legislative provisions to actually share and compare data. So what's collected in the battlefield at the moment, we cannot share with the AFP or we can't share with whole of government. So some of the mechanisms we're looking at, so we had a meeting today talking to the FBI with the unrecovered war remains, as well as ADF Investigative Services and Land 154, to looking at getting their CODIS DNA database, and then that would enable at least us to match things that we capture on the battlefield, and then with JCITF looking at the legislative and policy framework, then that would allow us to share with agencies such as the AFP in the future. So thank you, good question.
All right, I've got a related question about the sharing of information with the AFP. Do you see the classification of the IOC of IT systems to be a problem for sharing and exploiting data you're collecting?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So when you're looking at biometrics data, it should be unclassified because it doesn't have contextual information. And the way the UK and the US work is the sharing of the data between, say, the UK and the US is unclassified. And if they then get a match, then the agency has to request the contextual information and justify why you need that contextual information. That may be at a higher classification, but we may not need to share with the AFP what theatre of operation or the exact point or the exact people who collected it, but we can then share the information with the AFP. One thing that was come out with all the stakeholder engagement for the Five Eyes Forensic and Technical Exploitation Handbook is we need to address that exact issue within the handbook to make sure that people are classifying information appropriately so we can enable sharing at a Five Eyes level.
One last question. I'll ask one. Was there one over there?
If no one else has one,
Anna.
Linda McCann, who started at DST. What's next there? What do you see over the next couple of years? Where will this go?
I think with JCITF taking the lead for full spectrum exploitation, they're looking at equipping it, making it interoperable, working more with the AFP. So I came from an AFP background. And to be honest, when I was at the AFP, I did not know much about military forensics, and we didn't engage as much as we are doing now with Land 154. So building those ties with the AFP, Border Force as well, who are here in the audience today, will ensure that we get that interoperability, and also just making sure we all speak the same language, because it can be quite confusing when military are trying to talk to law enforcement. So I feel very positive about the future for forensic and technical exploitation within defence.
That was a
Thank you.
thanks.
Okay. Thanks everybody for coming along this afternoon, because this is, just really fantastic work, and to get 2 PhDs is pretty amazing stuff. When I first heard about Lauren's work, I thought about it immediately in the context of counter-terrorism, because I'd sort of done a job a while ago as the Commonwealth Counter-Terrorism Coordinator, and sort of thinking about the sort of forensics picture, I just sort of thought, okay, I can see the value there. And then after Lauren came to brief me, I sort of started thinking about it in terms of grey zone and grey zone conflict, hybrid warfare, and the possibility, and I thought about some of the context in Ukraine with, sort of the biometrics that they captured there, looking at people who were mercenaries or sort of, volunteers, but like going back, checking databases and saying, actually, this person has a special forces background, they're on leave without pay, surprise, surprise. And I was just, and again, in the maritime domain, really thinking about the potential around grey zone conflict, different vessels that aren't flagged and all, I then sort of, so I thought of, started off in the CT environment, but, talking to Lauren and then thinking more about it, I thought there's a great range of potentials here for defence by our whole of government partners. If we can get this right, there'll be enormous efficiencies, but also better outcomes for government in terms of data sharing, and again, hopefully it can lead to prosecutions or the prosecution of operations that deliver an effect in our national interest. So I'm really enthusiastic about trying to get support behind whatever legislative change we might need to be able to work effectively with AFP, with other agencies in the Home Affairs portfolio. And again, this is, you know, we've got to balance the you know, where does this sit in with the whole prioritisation, but I think this is there's an important role for this type of work in defence and with our whole of government partners as we go forward in the years ahead. So thanks for your work, Lauren. I think it's fantastic, and it'll make a great contribution